Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I was just reading an article about how 37% of firms here in the United States, companies, are now in trouble. And now, I'm not sure to what extent in trouble means, but I would imagine that a lot of these companies out there are now facing a situation in which their debt burdens have now made them a zombie. And now when we think about what a zombie is, a zombie corporation or zombie people, a lot of times when we think of zombies, we think of like the movies and how these monsters are coming out to you after you in the middle of the night. But that's not really what a zombie corporation or a zombie person is when you're considering it part of the economy. What a zombie is somebody or a corporation who can no longer continue on with their path of what they have going without ever increasing amounts of debt. That's ultimately what it is. Without the debt or a rolling over of their debt, they would no longer be able to function. And so if you can imagine that a lot of people who have just regular jobs, who have then strung themselves out on debt burdens for a new car, for a house, for credit cards, all the stuff that they've been spending, and now they are at a point in which that they can no longer function as far as a month-to-month basis without taking out ever-increasing amounts of debt, meaning that every month is another $100 on the credit card because they ran out of money. That's a zombie. Right? Somebody who needs to either earn more money or cut their expenses. And if they have an interest payment on their debt burden that then exceeds the amount of income they have, they are a zombie. Right? And that happens with corporations. It happens with people all the time. And the thing about it is that these zombies can go on for a long time, right? I mean, you can have, people who continue on making, credit card minimum payments and taking out ever increasing amounts of credit card debt and just keep going, right? For a long time until eventually even making the credit card minimum payment is no longer capable for them. And then that's when they fall into, bankruptcies or defaulting on some of their debts or something like that. And this is a common occurrence that takes place. So right now we have a lot of zombies in the system. When you had all the stimulus packages going out, people were buying expensive cars. They were buying, fancy things out there, buying expensive homes. This is creating the zombies. Right? Now, they may not have meant to, like as far as the people themselves, thinking that they would be able to continue on making these payments forever, and then all of a sudden their job gets cut, they get laid off or something like that, and then they find themselves all of a sudden being a zombie. So it wasn't even like necessarily bad decisions that got them there. Maybe it was not being cautious enough that got them there, but it wasn't necessarily bad, like they can make it at the time, but then they find themselves in a position in which they are now a zombie. And that also is occurring as layoffs are taking place and hours are getting cut. And so we're finding this happening with people, we're finding it happening with corporations. And now when we think about like what the Federal Reserve was saying and doing prior to the pandemic, because a lot of people, when they think about the Federal Reserve and their actions today, a lot of people really think that the Federal Reserve has lost control. Okay? So when you think about lost control, it means that they don't know what they're doing. It means they have no goal that is being achieved, right? That's another thing to think about, right? That no goal is being achieved. And if they have an outcome that is satisfactory, then that is a goal that was achieved. Okay, now, I know I'm probably losing a few of you on this, but stick with me for just a minute, because prior to the pandemic, one of the biggest concerns that was taking place at the Federal Reserve was a low neutral interest rate. And we've just recently talked about this in a video, right? And so this low neutral interest rate was creating a deflationary scenario within the economy. The Federal Reserve even said it, that it wasn't the inflation that was the problem. It was a persistently too low of an inflation expectation that was creating the problem. So they needed an inflation expectation that was elevated in order to raise the neutral interest rate. And now this is very complicated to think about, but what ultimately ended up happening here, okay, is that the Federal Reserve had too low of an interest rate on their Fed funds policy. It was around 2%. Remember, they had coming off of the Great Recession, interest rates were low. they started to raise them up using something called autopilot, where they were going to raise the Fed funds rate a quarter interest point every quarter regardless. Just say from now on until further notice, they were going to raise interest rates on the Fed funds level a quarter interest point every quarter from now on. Right? And the idea was behind this is that the market would predict that the Federal Reserve was going to continue to do this, and that they would be able to keep the markets elevated ahead of the Federal Reserve's Fed funds rate. Right? I mean, I think that was what the idea was, is that the market would anticipate the interest rate and therefore condition themselves for it ahead of time. But the problem is that the markets really started conditioning themselves for interest rate tightening, or the interest rates elevating and a tightening of the money supply and the financial conditions. So back in 2018, as they were raising these interest rates, they had what they called Jesus, I'm having a hard time talking. Taper tantrum, right? They were tapering the interest rates up, right? So just that quarter point, that autopilot. And they had the taper tantrum. And so they had to lower interest rates. And by lowering interest rates, what they ended up doing is that they had a situation that they were going to be rolling into a recession. But this is in 2019 that this has taken place. Then the pandemic kicks in and the recession starts. So they knew, like the Federal Reserve, if you go and you look at the Fed funds rate, almost always they peak out right before a recession and they start dropping right as the recession starts to take place. And then they drop them even further. So the Federal Reserve sees the recession coming. They're trying to, step ahead of it, but it's already too late because the recession is on its way. So they lower interest rates and then we move into a recession. And that was all taking place in 2019. So when you go and you look at what the Federal Reserve was saying and doing right before the pandemic, because remember, we didn't even know what they were going to do with the pandemic. I mean, that was like, something that was a what if still coming. But the Fed was doing at the time was lowering interest rates, and they had just started doing it because they couldn't get much more above 2% before the markets were predicting that there was going to be even more interest rates hiking, and it started causing a bunch of pain. So that's what was taking place in 2019 going into the pandemic. When the pandemic kicked in, this was like one of the best things that the Federal Reserve ever had to deal with their monetary policies, because all of a sudden it gave them the ability to do just about whatever it is that they wanted, because they had the unusual and exigent circumstances. Think about that. Unusual and exigent circumstances that gave the Federal Reserve and the Treasury powers that they typically would not have. If it wasn't for the pandemic kicking in, they wouldn't have been able to use these powers. Think about that. If the pandemic was not there, did not occur, they would not have been able to use the unusual and exigent circumstances to bail out the economy. In 2019, there was definite problems taking place, as we know the Federal Reserve was moving into a recession with the interest rates falling just like they have done just about every time for the last 30, 40 years. So when we see this happening, and you see it taking place, and then all of a sudden the unusual and exigent circumstances kick in, and now you have bailouts of every corner of the financial market because of the pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession, right? COVID-induced recession. They said it over and over and over again. If you go and you look at my videos, I was almost making fun of it, right? Because it was a recession that was happening anyway. But because they made it, because it was so worse, it made it possible for them to use unusual and exigent circumstances, and that completely bailed out the entire system. Now, one of the things that I tried to really get people to focus in on, because it's something that not a lot of people, I think, talk about, was the bailing out of the corporations at that time. Okay. When they bailed out these corporations at that time, they had flooded a lot of companies with cash. And now some companies are sitting on enough cash to carry them over this recession that we're running into, or downturn, or whatever it is that people want to call it. It's probably going to be a major crash. If you have 37% of companies that are going to fail, which who knows how many are actually going to fail. But a bunch of these companies are sitting on cash ready to deal with the situation. They got that cash at an incredibly low interest rate during the pandemic because of the special purpose vehicle that was set up using unusual and exigent circumstances that they would typically not have this power for. They set up something called the corporate debt lending facility. right? And that corporate debt lending facility was promising to buy the debt, the bonds, the basically lending money, right? That's the way to say it. Lending money to these corporations by buying their bonds. So for those who don't understand, like corporate debt, that's what they were doing, was lending money to corporations by buying their bonds. And they told everybody that this is exactly what they were going to do. They bought a little bit. Some ETFs that had these bonds in it, they bought some of it. It was a lot of, quite a few $1 billion worth. And people went, oh my gosh, look, they're actually doing it. That credible threat alone got the markets to start front running the Fed, buying into these corporate debt, which flooded all the corporations with a lot of money. Some of them sat on that money, but a lot of them started spending that money, and they started hiring people, buying equipment, doing all kinds of stuff that started having economic input going into the economy. And mainly they were hiring a lot of those people away from the service positions. So as a group of people retired, a whole bunch of people moved up into a corporate position, started working from home or doing whatever, and it left the service industry depleted of people. Right? This is where they all ended up going up into. Now the Federal Reserve is in a position in which that when raising interest rates, not only are the corporations already bailed out because they're sitting on a bunch of cash, but the ones who shouldn't have been there in the first place, who borrowed far more money than they should have, right? The zombie corporations are going to get their heads knocked off. Right? And you can see 37% of them are now sitting in a position in which that it's going to be very painful going into the future. As those people lose their jobs, they're going to find employment over in the service industry. It may not be a job they want, but it's a job that's available. And if there's a job that's available, somebody's going to end up filling it. And that's where the Federal Reserve now is sitting in a position in which that the corporations have already been bailed out, and they won't have to worry about unemployment rising beyond a point that it is too painful for them to keep interest rates elevated, right? See, now they're in a position in which interest rates can stay elevated, corporations can start failing, those people who lose those jobs will go over to the service industry, so the unemployment will end up staying low as they keep these interest rates elevated. They won't have to worry about bailing out the corporations, or the government won't have to worry about doing it, because they were already bailed out during the pandemic and they're sitting on enough cash right now. So over the next year or two, as the interest rates stay elevated and they start hacking the hell out of these zombie people and zombie corporations, and all this bankruptcy starts to take place, you're going to find that at the other end of this, that the corporations will have had the cash to basically carry themselves through this whole thing. Right? That's what I see happening here. I mean, take a look at the article. It's like, and think about that theory behind it. Like, there's a lot of other people who have other theories behind it, but this is my theory, and it's been there for pretty much since the beginning of the channel. I mean, we've been talking about the low neutral interest rate since pretty much, the channel has started. So this is one of the things that the Federal Reserve absolutely needed to fix, was to raise that neutral interest rate and get that elevated so that the Fed funds rate can move up to this 5% position. And that way, when the next time they run into a recession, they can actually have some ammo to fight it. That was their major problem, is that they simply just ran out of monetary policy and they needed to get it back, or else the whole system would fail. And now they're getting it back. That doesn't sound like a failure to me. All right, uneducated economist, you let me know.